Welcome back. More news at this hour. Recent news that China is officially falling into deflation has raised concerns that its economy will become trapped in a downward spiral. Anxiety is rising that China is entering an era of much slower economic growth, similar to the period of Japan's lost decades, which saw consumer prices and wages stagnate for a generation. Nastassia Arendse, in fact, spoke to Izak Odendaal, investment strategist at Old Mutual Multi-Managers, to unpack what China's deflation means for investors.
I think deflation is actually good news. It means falling prices, but essentially when you have persistent deflation, so you mustn't get too carried away with just 1 month's number, but when you have persistent deflation, it basically means that there's people are going to start postponing spending because they believe that prices will be cheaper in the future. So they postpone spending, they postpone investment decisions. And it really just saps the economy of dynamism. And so these episodes of persistent deflation are quite rare, but we've seen them in Japan over several decades now, since the 1990s. We also saw it in the Great Depression in the US in the 1930s. And the other big problem is that when you have high debt levels, deflation becomes particularly bad because the value of debt is always fixed at one level. But then the income that is needed to service that debt is falling as prices fall. So you really don't want to be stuck in a kind of a deflationary trap.
So give us some context here in terms of China. What do we know about its problems so far, and why is this economic recovery losing momentum?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, the hopes for a strong economic recovery as China exited its hard lockdowns have really sputtered. And I think the big problem is essentially that there is just too much debt, much of that debt tied to real estate, to property, and the property market, having been extremely strong over the last 10 or so years, has just now kind of lost its oomph. And I think it's emerging now that there's just too much. There was overbuilding, empty apartment buildings, too much property for the population, all the typical things you associate with a property bubble. So again, debt is fixed, but the property prices that are linked to this debt are now starting to fall, and that is a major problem. So what happens now is that people focus on repaying debt. They try and minimize their debt burden, which is always a good thing to do when you're an individual. But when everybody's doing it at the same time, it means that there is less spending in the economy and more focus on paying down debt. And that reduction in spending is ultimately what causes the economy to really go into quite a bad space. So with that, there's the other structural problem, of course, of a population that's starting to go into decline. Because of the one-child policy, China's population is now shrinking. And as you can imagine, when you have a smaller population, you need less things, you need less houses, you need less cars, et cetera, et cetera. So that is also a long-term headwind for China's economy. Now, there's still a lot of things that you can say, positive things that you can say about the economy. There's still a lot of innovations coming out. They're world leaders in certain sectors. But I think the bottom line is you need to expect slower growth, much slower growth in the years ahead than we saw, in the previous decade or so.
You mentioned Japan in your initial response. I mean, are there similarities here in terms of what we're seeing with China, or are there differences here between what's going on with China and what happened with Japan earlier on?
Yeah, so Japan, just for background, also had a massive property bubble in the 1980s, also lots of debt, and then that bubble burst in 1990. And really since then, it was a slow process in Japan of households and companies paying down debt. And Japan ultimately fell into deflation in the mid-90s and stayed there for quite a long time. So there are these obvious parallels, the parallel of the bubble bursting, the parallel of too much debt, the parallel also of an economy that is too much geared towards fixed investment, so too much building of stuff and not enough spending by consumers. China is unique today in the sense that only about 40% of economic activity relates to consumer spending. Countries like South Africa, it's 60%. In countries US and Europe, it's even higher. So most modern economies revolve around consumer spending, but China revolves around building things, fixed investment, and that's simply unsustainable where it is now at its current level of investment. So those are the similarities with Japan. I think the key differences are, number one, that Japan was a rich country when this happened. 1990, Japan was already a very rich country. China is still a poor country. It's got a big economy, but that's because it's got 1 billion plus people. On a per capita basis, China is kind of sort of a middle income country, not a rich country. So there's still room for China to grow and kind of catch up with the richer countries of this world. So I think that's an important difference with Japan. And I think the other key difference is China is a state-owned, state-controlled economy. So in a sense, the government can possibly manage this better than the Japanese government can, because the Chinese government can tell companies, individuals, who is going to bear these losses. Because someone will have to bear these losses. There are write-downs that will have to happen. And the question is who? Is it the banks? Is it the property developers? Is it people who bought the properties? Where do these losses ultimately land? And I think in a state-controlled, tightly state-controlled system, in theory, you can manage this process of deleveraging better than you can in a market economy where it tends to be quite chaotic. The problem, of course, is that in a state-owned economy, the state can also make mistakes. In a state-controlled economy, so if they don't get this right, they can end up being even worse.